All right, so my rhetorical analysis is going to be in the field of economics. So current economic papers have shown the growing divide between writing and mathematical models and graphs. So contemporary papers have that I'll be using for this example will be Ator 2016, Ator 2020, and Acemoglu 2022. So yeah, the names will the papers are called so Ator's paper in 2016 is called The Contribution of Minimum Wage to US Inequality Over 3 Decades. The Ator paper in 2020 is The Fall and of the Labor Share and the Rise of Superstar Firms. And for 2022, Daron Acemoglu's paper is Learning from Views, the Selection Effect and the Speed of Learning. So yes, so economics, right, is dominated by mathematical models and graphs because of how the core structure of economics originated. The discipline's main focus is to create a system that can describe how production, consumption, resources, value, and growth are moved through rational agents, and the discipline tries to extrapolate those factors to mirror the real world. In more recent times, more economic journals have been published um, using these graphs and econometric tools. So next, I'm going to go into formatting. So formatting between the three papers will be shown first through their structure, which I'm going to be explaining in this formatting section. Second will be through their models, and third will be through their tables and graphs. So the models and graphs that I'm going to be using will be taken from the papers themselves and will be explained through how they function within their respective papers. In all three papers, introductions use a simple layout of what will so on all three, they use a simple layout with abstract and explanations and that sort. So in the fall of the labor share and the rise of the superstar firms, in October 2020, the paper's abstract and introduction discusses how the labor share has fallen in the US and how the rise of capital has changed over 30 years. So in this example text in October 2020, so this is a quotation in the paper itself, the fall of labor share of GDP in the United States and many other countries in recent decades is well documented, but its causes remain uncertain. Existing empirical assessments typically rely on industry or macro data, obscuring the heterogeneity among firms. This is accompanied by a graph showing how much it has increased and its comparisons compared to other countries around the globe. So this is in the abstract itself, where they use mostly words to try to convey their meaning. The references all yeah, so their references of the papers have been during the text are only represented with the author's name and the year. So in an example, in the papers themselves, they use the author's name, Acemoglu, and then the paper's year, which is 2022, with the references being at the end of the page, which I have also emulated in this paper itself. Messages are conveyed mainly through logos data, and facts of all three papers spend most of the time explaining the models and graphs themselves, as well as mathematical proofs. The ethos is almost non-existent in all three papers. You have to be that's most of what I've found, and you have to have extensive knowledge of math to understand what the papers present without it being extremely esoteric. So I've for most of these papers, the mathematics behind it is kind of beyond me. A lot of it is using like very advanced like calculus or like calculus 4, like very just kind of advanced math. But the beginning stages of the models are usually pretty simple. So that's what I'll be discussing in the model section. Let's see. And then lastly, proofs are extensively used in the papers because the math, if the math and the models are airtight, the only thing other economists can really critique on the papers is not the math, but the methodology and the philosophy behind the models themselves. Um, And lastly, econometrics, which is just economic statistics, is also used in the papers because it shows how the economy is functioning through statistics to support the papers. In Autor 2016 and Autor 2020, both graphs show how minimum wage and labor share have been affected by the US economy by showing how the real minimum wage and labor share have risen and fell. Conclusions in all three summed up the initial claims, discussing how the graphs and models explain the introduction and a brief review of each part of the paper. So next I'm going to go through to section 2.1 and an example of a model in the paper itself. So this is the most simple model I found in the three papers that could probably accurately show what models are like in economics. So in the scholarship of economics, economic modeling is used to convey the meaning and reasoning in a concise, airtight equation. For instance, in Learning from Reviews, the Selection Effect and Speed of Learning from Deer and Acemoglu, the paper tries to represent the Bayesian beliefs of the customer when it comes to rating systems for the product. An example that that isn't really talked about in the paper, but I feel like is very easy to understand, will be the 5-star rating system in Amazon and its reviews in it. So in this model above, which isn't exactly the rating system that goes further into the paper, but just kind of how people's utility is derived from a purchase of a product. So in model 1 shows how the individual is utility is when buying a product. So how much happiness they get from buying the product. Where P in the variable is the price of the product. Theta T is the ex ante of the type of the customer, so forecast of the customer, so features of the product and value it's given before purchase. Zeta T is the preference function for the preferences of the product itself, so it's branding, where it's from, and other intrinsic values placed by the customer. And Q is the true value of the product, with 1 being high quality and 0 being low quality. Lastly, the UT being the utility, meaning roughly the measure of happiness. So kind of how much the product that they buy gives happiness towards the individual. So, and in Acemoglu's model, the variables a person values, so things that give positive utility, are quality, preference, and features, which will increase the person's utility while the price will decrease the utility. So for example, if the product is really expensive, buying it will not give them as much utility if it was for free. The model is given at the very beginning of Acemoglu 2022 in the paper, and it's a very simple way of showing the utility function for the rest of the paper going forward, though how he derives each variable is complicated, and the beginning model is to kind of show the big picture of how it goes forward. So next is the graphs and tables. So mostly I just focused on the graph section itself because I feel like it's the most easiest to understand. And so graphs are mostly used in economics to quickly gauge and visualize the author's main points through usually a time series graph like the one above. The graph is taken from the contribution of the minimum wage, the U.S. minimum wage over the over 3 decades, a reassessment from, or that's what the paper is called. And in the graph itself, the y-axis is the log real minimum wage, while the x-axis is the year. To really kind of like make this simple, is that the real minimum wage, or basically minimum wage taking into account inflation, has been falling in recent decades from its high in the log real minimum wage being 2.2 to around, I guess it's about 2. And really what the paper is trying to show is that with the real minimum wage falling, it affects how people working minimum wage are worse off now than they are in the past. So, in conclusion, looking at all three papers shows how the rhetorical devices in economic journals are mostly used to define and support mathematics and graphs. Though the abstract is solely text, once you dive into the papers themselves, they use mainly math to support the original argument. Both authors had a different style in presenting their data, with Acemoglu using mathematical models while Ator used graphs. The conclusions of the papers remained consistent throughout the text and were very easy to understand. Um, and lastly, kind of the conclusion of what I'm trying to get at is that the pursuit of all these graphs for economics itself is to create a better world or system through resource allocation for all humans to live simply better lives, and just through more free time or better quality lives or longer lives. Though economics is often called the dismal science, it should instead be viewed much more optimistically. With advances in understanding of economics, with the understanding of economics, humans today live much better lives than just 100 years ago, and economic systems are much more stable now than they are in the past, and growth is better understood. Hopefully 100 years into the future, economics will be so well understood that our systems today will look like feudal economies in the past. And this is my references section. So yeah, that's basically it. Thank you for watching the video.